Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, everyone. We hope you are well, and thank you for joining us for this iL6 session this morning. It's just occurred to me I'm working from home, and I can see behind myself how much of a mess this is. This is my office, but it's also our dumping room. So please excuse the mess of pitch frames one side, and I think this side is my golf clubs and a pushchair. This is the life of a family. We hope you're well. Just by way of introduction, I think I met you all at the last session. I've seen you perform. I'm James Brown, and I'm the Managing Director at Inspiring Leaders. And I have the privilege of working alongside Dirk, who I think you're all very familiar with. But Dirk, do you want to say good morning?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I think everyone knows me now, so I'm Dirk. Welcome to our second iL6 session. And you're fortunate enough to have James presenting on this one. So we'll try and take it in turns. And we think we're going to have Ben Jordan present on the third one. So just to mix it up a bit. So you're not just having me for a 6-hour block of iL6. So it's a great session that James has planned. And I'm sure last time you really got involved with the chat, which we didn't know how it was going to work out, but it worked out really, really well. So please get involved in the chat, and we'll be sharing those comments. If you'd like to say something, that'd be great. If not, then obviously sit in the background and do your own thinking, as we always encourage with these sessions. But yeah, enjoy.
Absolutely. And Dirk has properly overstated the privilege of having me present this morning. But we did talk quite a lot, Dirk and I, about which in the sequence of iL6 should come next. Which is going to be most pertinent for you, which we think will be most relevant for you. And as you know, last time we looked at resilience and emotional intelligence, and we felt that was the most pertinent thing at the time. And today we're going to be focusing on professionalism and reflectiveness as a set of qualities and skills. So Dirk, would you mind just taking us on to sharing my slides on the screen? Perfect, thank you. So look, a couple of things to say. We know that there are a bunch of you that are going to be accessing this session live this morning. So you're very welcome to join us. And we also know this is a session that will be recorded and will be shared out with colleagues and trainees who are accessing this in an asynchronous fashion. So for those of you that are live, we'll go through some of the conditions for this morning's session in a second. And for those of you that aren't live, welcome, and we're sorry you're not with us at the moment. So in terms of content for today's session, as you can see, we're looking at professional reflective as the two qualities. And the first thing I would say here is just in terms of what we're trying to do with regards to the purpose of these sessions. So it's really important for us that you're in a comfortable place, hopefully tidier than where I'm sat, but I'm sure some of you will be in similar spaces, whether you're in a training room at the Flying High Centre or elsewhere, or indeed you're sat in a living room or a bedroom or an office somewhere in your own house, possibly a dining room, kitchen. So make sure you're comfortable. We really want you to try and clear your mind of what's happened this week. It's Friday. If I'm honest, I'm a little bit frazzled as well. That's fine, but I think we need to get into a space where we can concentrate and reflect upon ourselves and what we've been currently experiencing on placement or in training, or maybe something separate to that. So just do your best to try and clear your mind and focus on the content this morning. We said this last time, but we really encourage free writing, journaling, the ability to just put pen to paper, almost a lost art for some people. So we really would ask you to have a notebook or even a device to hand. I know some people are using digital devices for this type of thing now, whichever feels the most appropriate for you. But for you to be able to just think about the situations and the activities that we encourage you to go through this morning, which are all part of the learning process. Don't feel an obligation to have to contribute in the chat space, as Dirk mentioned before. Actually, we really welcomed it at the last session. It was brilliant to be able to have such fruitful and rich contributions, but it isn't an obligation. This is a private stream, so it's not going out publicly. Nobody else is listening in apart from the other trainees on the course. So it is a safe space, and you know that your contributions are welcome, but there is no obligation. This is a reflective opportunity for you, and nothing more. And understand particularly that this is an investment in you and your professional development. So I'm very mindful that you're probably on absolute learning overload. We know that you are still accessing very frequent training. You're in the middle of PG studies, most of you, and you're accessing the day-to-day challenges and richness of experience of being in school and on placement, which is just, you know, a huge overload in one way or another. But today is a slightly different tack. It's an opportunity for you to just think about yourselves and think about your qualities and characteristics that we describe the iL6 as. Just a couple of reminders which Dirk is just going to walk through regards to the formality of the iL6.
Yep. It's also I'd like to say, James, that Kate's put on that there's a number of them watching together at the Flying High HQ. So welcome
Brilliant.
on the big screen. So that's brilliantly together. So you'll have a different sort of experience where you can share things if you'd like to in your group, which is nice as well. So thanks for joining us together. At Flying High. So the first thing is that iL6 isn't formally assessed. So you will have done a self-assessment on this, and we'll be repeating them. I think you've done one fairly recently, and we'll continue to do them until you leave into the program and then joining the ECT program. So we're not formally assessing it. So this work is for you and your own development. It's not going to form part of anything else other than that. So we believe that the best way of doing this is that equal balance of theoretic input and time to reflect. And as you'll have experienced this the first time we did this, and today's a similar format, there'll be a lot of pauses, a lot of time for you to reflect, as James has said. So don't be frightened of that. It's not going to be 2 hours of us piling information at you, which can feel the case sometimes with some of the sessions. But this one definitely isn't. There'll be lots of pauses, and that's okay to go and get yourself a cup of coffee and to use it as that. We want it to be as relaxing as possible to get the best reflection out.
Especially if you've got that nice Flying High coffee machine on tap, that's grand, isn't it? Keep yourself topped up.
Yeah, so James mentioned there that time to freely write. So please do that. I know, like, we're not going to check it, are we? But it is nice to get. I've got lots of things by the side of me that I just can scribble in and stuff like that. So please do freely write, and it can be linked to today's session, or it can just be stuff that you've got in your mind from what's happened this week, planning for next week, whatever it might be. We just want, almost like, it's quite nice it's on a Friday, to spill it out so you can have a weekend where you can relax with your friends and family and your pastimes that you're into. And I've mentioned that already, so there will be comfort breaks in there. So when we do say go away for 15-20 minutes, then please do so. And we're going to start with the called, which is where we're going to hopefully encourage that way of spilling out those thoughts on your paper, ready to start the session.
Thanks, Dirk. And is it possible to have subtitles? That's a really good question. Rebecca, just to answer that, in a live stream, subtitles aren't possible. This is a recording, and when the recording is pushed live through the YouTube software, then captions are on there. But at the moment, I'm afraid I can't give you subtitles. So I'm so sorry about that. Hopefully you can find some headphones or find a space to be able to listen in. Okay, so on this call, I think this is a really good sort of positioning opportunity just for you, just to think about yourself. So I'd encourage you just to grab that pen and paper we just keep talking about. And there's a couple of just questions and things we'd like you to just give a little bit of time to just to get us started with this morning's session. So what words might describe how you're feeling today? What are you thinking about? What needs just to be written and left on that piece of paper just for a while? How are you clearing your mind, getting into the right space? Just have a minute or two just to make some notes on that. Just get that to-do list down. Sometimes difficult to walk into a session like this knowing there are things that just need doing. So this is your chance just to get them down on paper. You can always pick them up again later. The next thing I want you to do, just at the very top of the session, is just write down what your understanding is of both professional and separately reflective. What does professional mean to you in the context of your training course and the profession that you're heading into? And what does it mean to be reflective, to be a reflective practitioner, to be a reflective person? What does good reflection look like? And building on that, what does good reflection bring to you? How does it help you to improve what you're doing on a daily basis? Are you a good, honest? Can you reflect honestly? Do you feel that you're accurate with your reflections? Or perhaps maybe you don't engage in reflection in a way that perhaps you think you might ought to. Okay. Thank you for taking the time to do that this morning. It's a really important place to start. And it just gives you an opportunity just to get into the right mindset as we walk into the next session, the next slide. Okay, we're going to start with an image of a model, a situation. And we want you to think first and foremost at the top of this session, start of this session, about something that you have observed, a situation, maybe something you've experienced in school recently, or possibly in training or at university or somewhere in between that relates to your teaching practice and your training practice. I want you to think about something that maybe left you feeling, for one reason or another, maybe you can't quite put your finger on it, something that maybe left you feeling a bit unsettled or didn't quite match with your value set. It's quite a personal thing. We're not asking you to break any confidences here. We don't want you to necessarily name any specific individuals or any specific situations that you'd be sharing publicly. It's just an opportunity for you to think about something that you just saw or experienced or were part of recently that just didn't feel right. What did you see? How did it make you feel? What difference did it make to the way that you think? And as a result of this situation, this event, this conversation, whatever that was, have you changed your opinion or your perspective or maybe even your approach? Now, obviously, we're not going to be asking you to share this in the chat bar. This is something that may be very nuanced point, something that you just caught the back end of, or something that was really big and profound, like a staff meeting or an interaction with a parent or child. So we're not going to ask you to share this, but I think it's really important at the very beginning you can just think about this situation, because this is something we're going to ask you to come back to as we progress through this morning's session. So just spend a few minutes going back through some of those questions. What did you see? How did it make you feel? What difference did it make to the way you think? And as a result, have you changed your opinion or your perspective or your approach on how that might have been done differently, or you might have approached that differently? Just going to pause there for a moment. Okay. Thank you for that. And let's move into the first part of this morning's session then, where we're going to focus on professionalism, to be a professional, and why we believe that professionalism is important within the teaching profession and the education sector as a whole, and indeed the public sector, and actually just professional life in general. Some definitions here are: the professional teacher maintains the highest professional conduct and ensures that they know and understand their professional responsibilities. They are wholly child-centred. And as you all know, having passed through our interview process, that's one of the key things that we're looking for when we're recruiting you to our programme and into the profession, is this child, pupil, young person centred attitude. So you're all past that, which is grand. And now as you move through your career, it's important that that remains front and center of everything you do. Very, very tightly connected to words like integrity, which is obviously very important to us. So professionalism, again, is defined by a number of people. So McLean, Blackwell, in a paper, Teachers and Teaching Theory in 2012, describe professionalism as commonly understood as an individual's adherence to a set of standards, a code of conduct, or collection of qualities that characterize accepted practice within a particular area of activity. Shade wordy, in my opinion, but that might resonate with some of you. Another definition of this comes from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which is: professionalism is the conduct, aims, or qualities that characterize or mark a profession or professional person. And that perhaps might be a little bit more of a sort of shorter, more engaging quote about what professionalism is. But what I'm particularly interested to know from you is whether you believe that teaching is a profession, or that you maybe believe that teaching is a vocation. And let's have a look at what that might mean to separate those two things out. So a profession is an occupation that requires specialized knowledge and skills. A person who has mastered these can be called a professional. Professions are typically associated with higher education, though there are exceptions to this rule, especially in fields such as medicine or law. Professions require years of training and experience to become successful. In addition to having the right training and education, professionals must also have good communication skills that allow them to communicate effectively with other people in their field, so they can share information about their work with others. So on your page in front of you, I'd like you to draw, I guess, a classic set of scales. It's almost a seesaw type diagram. And without drawing the horizontal plank or bar across that at the moment, just from a first impression, just giving a score out of 10, with 10 being very, very much so, and 1 being probably not. Teaching, based on that definition, 10 is absolutely it's a profession. 1 is no, it's not a profession. What does your first impression of that quote look like and mean to you? Is teaching a profession? If it really, really is, it's a 10. If you're not quite sure, a bit more ambivalent, it could be a 5 or a 6. If you don't think teaching's a profession, then you need to score that a 1 or a 2 or something quite low on that. What about a vocation? Well, a vocation is a career that you're drawn to or feel that you were born to do. It's not something that you chose. It's something that maybe chooses you. And once it does, it's the best thing ever. Vocations are extremely rewarding and fulfilling. They allow us to make a difference in the world and help others. They can also be very lucrative and offer good salaries and benefits. But importantly, vocations can give us the opportunity to learn about ourselves and grow as people. It's quite a emotive description of a vocation there, isn't it? Feels like a different approach to this in terms of definition. So back to that ranking scale, that sort of counterbalance scales. On the opposite side now of that plank, or the opposite side of the seesaw, if you like, in the other seat, how does that resonate with you? Do you think teaching's a vocation? What number out of 10 would you give it? Be very interested to know. And now you've got possibly a higher number and possibly a lower number. You might have 2 5s, so you can draw that seesaw center. I can't think about the word, but let's say it's the plank or the center structure. What does that look like for you? Do you believe that teaching is a profession or a vocation? And what makes it one over the other? And that's just something for you to think about. I'm going to give you just a minute or so now just to jot down. I believe teaching is ... I think that might be, I believe teaching is more of a vocation ... or I believe teaching is more of a profession ... because all of us approach the profession and our professions and our work in a slightly different way. Some of you will have come straight from university and always wanted to work with children and young people. Likewise, there are people in the room who are listening to this call who have come from industry and have done maybe 2 or 3 other jobs before coming to teaching. Arguably, that might mean that's a greater calling because this was coming to them all along, something they've been putting off since they were young. And now they're in the profession, and now they're in following what they believe is a vocational pathway. So let's just write that sentence again. I believe teaching is ... whatever your preference is. And this is because there's no right or wrong answer here. It's a very personal position on this. I found a lovely quote that was interesting. So a profession is something that you do to earn a living, and a vocation is your calling in life. Almost separates the two things out, but it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What is it? Is it a profession or a vocation? So look, we've done a bit of writing now, and I'm really keen to get some feedback in the chat bar, which I'm not looking at. So I know we've got a 10-second delay. It's always the case with this particular place, but if you could just put your views generally in the chat bar, I'd be really interested to know. Remember, there's no judgment on this. So what do you believe? Vocation, profession, and why? It'd be great to get some feedback on that. Be really helpful to see what you're thinking. I'm using my softest, slowest voice for this session, so if you've fallen to sleep, it's time to wake up. I'm actually quite enjoying the slower pace of this. It's been a really busy week, so I'm sure it has been for you. Have we got any contributions to that in the comments bar? I can't see anything popping through at the moment.
We've got nothing yet, James. It's that thing as a teacher, you'll have all had it, where you ask a question to the class, and then how long can you leave it? It's a bit of a stare off, isn't it?
Here we go. So contribution from someone here. So as someone who is training at a later stage, it's definitely a vocation for me. No matter what I've done in my career, I've kept coming back to teaching. Thank you for that, Kirsty. It's interesting that, isn't it? You'd think possibly, I mean, there's argument all the way around, isn't there? You could argue that if this is something you've always wanted to do from the point at which you were at school and you were thinking that you always wanted to be a teacher. My little girl's 6 today, and she would love to be a teacher. And so for her, it might well feel like it's a vocation. It's something that's always drawn her in. She's always wanted to do. And yet, like Kirsty said there, actually, argue that feeling is stronger when you've done alternative jobs or worked in alternative professions or industries, because you genuinely are making a career change to be here and do this. It's a very provocative point, but it's one nonetheless that we've been able to just think about this morning. And it might be one that you think about further and discuss after today. I was just talking to Dirk before we came online this morning, I'm a chair of governors in a school in Leicester, and the school in particular is a special school, and it feels to me like there's almost a stronger vocational pull and feeling in that school than there has been in some mainstream primaries or secondaries I've been in the past, because of the nature of the young people that are in. Getting some more comments popping through, so thank you, Kate, Stacey, Mika, etc. What we've got, I think it's both. I'm driven to it, but it requires a range of skills and knowledge. Yeah, I mean, there's an argument, isn't there, that that definition of professional was a bit sort of dismissive of teaching. Or if you were to say, oh, it's definitely a profession, it sort of implies that there's no great specialist knowledge, which of course teaching really, really requires. You have to be it's a craft, isn't it? It's something that refines over a period of time. You work on and you constantly think about improving. Stacey said here, if I just pull down, it's something I've always wanted to do, but never thought I was able to do. So being an older student, you've been unkind to yourself there, Stacey. You decided to go for it, and that's a very common feeling, Stacey, amongst what I would class as our career changes. And just for definition, our mature students. I think, Dirk, am I right in saying mature is over 25?
Yeah, that's
right?
That is the definition of it with the data. But yeah,
I'm not saying the under 25s aren't mature, by the way, but it is nice to know that the DFE think that when you get to 25, you're definitely considered mature. But a lot of our career changers say this to us, Stacey, certainly during the kind of pre-stages of interview, about just getting a feel for, like, I've always wanted to teach, didn't think I could do it. I never felt I had the skills or the qualities or the patience or the knowledge, but actually, hopefully this course is making that a reality for you. Got Mika here, or Micah. I think it's 50-50, because it takes a lot of specialized skill and knowledge to become a good teacher, but it's also such an emotional job, which you really need to feel connected to. I fully agree. I did a piece of work on my own masters a few years ago around head teacher stress levels, primary head teacher stress levels. And one of the things I did in my reading was loads and loads of research about teacher stress levels, not specifically about head teacher stress levels. But what researchers did find that suggested that, generally speaking, teachers may well feel highly stressed, but they get the benefit of seeing those wonderful light bulb moments in the classroom. So this sort of job satisfaction in teaching is also really high, even though it's a real grind at times. It's that kind of notion of emotional labor versus the joy of seeing learning. Comment from Isabel, coming straight from university. I've always wanted to teach, even in primary schools. It's a vocation for me, I suppose. Fantastic. I believe teaching is a vocation because you've got to have a love and passion from Beth to complete our roles. And care and nurture, Isabel, it's a hard job. You've got to have drive for it as well as the skills. And Rebecca's followed up finally here with, I think some can see it as a profession with a holiday and time off, but I think to be really effective teacher, it needs to have a calling to it. It's a really good point, Rebecca. Look, I think it's fine as well, isn't it? The reality is we all kind of need pay in one way or another. Like, we've all got bills to pay and overheads and families and pastimes and activities we like to do. So I personally would say the root of teaching is it's vocational, but it is absolutely a profession in terms of the skills required to get there. But that's just my view. You'll all have your own points of view on that, which has been really helpful. So thank you for your contributions to that. So let's move on a little bit, and let's move into the next slide here around teaching or public servant. This is really interesting, and particularly with the rise of academy trusts and this possibly some of the false information that exists in the sector about, well, I'm a teacher, but I work in an academy trust, which is just a charitable organisation, by the way, that schools are entrusted to as organisations. So how do you see yourselves? You're obviously a teacher, but are you a public servant? What do I mean by a public servant? Is that someone that works in Whitehall or someone that works at the local authority? Maybe a public servant to you is someone that, comes and collects the bins in the morning or sits in a local authority office. But a teacher is quite a defined role. So do you see yourself as a teacher or as a public servant? And maybe what's the difference? It's just a top level thought on this, because this is a really important slide next about the principles of public office. So the Nolan principles were established a number of years ago, I think probably back in the 80s, 90s, as a set of principles for anyone that serves in public office. They are, as you can see on the screen here, selflessness, objectivity, openness, leadership, integrity, accountability, and honest. And actually, I think that's the fabric for probably what makes a really good society and a really good human in general. But particularly those people that are working with or working within public organisations, be that government, be that local government, be that arguably charities that are funded by the government, be that schools or hospitals, police services, fire services, all those essential services. I've got some questions here for you. And I don't mean to be provocative, and there's no political slant on this. Do you think all those principles are upheld by our leaders in our country? Can you think of examples of where maybe at times people end up in positions of power, or not necessarily power, but in positions of responsibility locally or nationally or regionally or just within your own community, that maybe don't reflect all of those principles all of the time? How does that make you feel? How do you think things should be done differently? What should the accountability, which is one of those principles, look like for those individuals or organisations that perhaps don't follow these really important national principles of effective public office? I think it goes without saying, doesn't it, without naming individuals, that probably in the last 4 or 5 years, not always seen this, have we? Definitely some things in here around openness, honesty, accountability. Indeed, these are all interconnected, but maybe haven't been reflected at a national level for sure. One might argue, depending on where you are and what your experiences are, these haven't necessarily been enacted and delivered within your settings, perhaps. And this actually, as a framework, might talk to that original situation, that original model that we asked you to think about. Which of these principles didn't you see? Or, indeed, which of these principles were seen too much in that situation? I just want you to know about the Nolan principles. They're really effective and really important as a framework for the way in which this country is governed, the way in which locally, nationally, regionally, etc., public servants and teachers, the view is generally that you would be a public servant, you would fall within the public sector. These principles are there for everybody to be aware of, and they're really important. I wanted you to be aware of those before we move into the very specific standards that underpin your work. So as you will know, in England, we have a set of teacher standards, and these have been formed by our government. They're issued by law, and you must follow them unless there's good reason not to. They define a minimum level of practice for trainees and for teachers to achieve qualified teacher status. And schools can use them and do use them to assess the performance of teachers with qualified teacher status. And those that are, of course, connected into the school teachers appraisal system and regulations that were set out in 2012. You'll be aware of the teacher standards. I know we talk a lot about assessment against curriculum, but I'd be flabbergasted if by now you hadn't done some research into this or been reflecting on these a little bit within your practice. Let's have a look at what they are. They're separated into two parts. So the first part one relates to the standards of teaching and defines the outcomes of a teacher that must adhere to. They are setting high expectations which inspire, motivate, and challenge pupils. Are you always doing that? Are you always seeing that? How do you do that when you're tired and busy and just having an off day? How do you demonstrate that? How do you evidence it? Do those around you think you're delivering this high expectations, inspiring and motivating and challenging pupils? The second standard, or the second part of part one, is around promoting good progress and outcomes for our pupils. So how do you do that? How do you demonstrate where progress has been made? How can you see progress? You've probably seen it on a daily and minute by minute basis with some of your pupils and students. And how do you promote really good progress? How do you promote this feeling for your students of moving forward, of there is more to learn, there are learning objectives or outcomes for these lessons or this short and long-term piece of work? How do you talk about where we would like pupils to get to? Sort of relates very closely to standard one. How do you demonstrate good subject and curriculum knowledge? Primary teaching and secondary teaching quite differently. Got different expectations here to some extent. Secondaries need to focus heavily on being real subject experts. They've often done a subject specific degree. Their subject knowledge is exemplar in one particular field, one particular curriculum subject. And that's really challenging to maintain up-to-date recent knowledge of research and all the things that come with that, making sure that you are continually teaching students and pupils the things they need to know to be successful, both through their examinations, but also in life. And of course, primary colleagues have a different task in hand. They need to have a breadth of knowledge of subjects because they're expected to teach across the curriculum. And that means there's not always time or necessarily an inclination to be an expert in all those fields. It's really complex. It's really difficult to know lots in all those spaces. How are you demonstrating that within your work? You plan and teach well-structured lessons, and by now, particularly in your training, you will be getting to a point where this is becoming a little bit more refined. The planning stage in particular will becoming hopefully a little bit less time-consuming for you. You'll have got into a bit more of a routine. You'll be working with your colleagues in your alternative placement schools at the moment to think about how you plan and teach well-structured lesson. And of course, you'll be researching into what effective lesson structure looks like and effective lesson design. And that hopefully will continue throughout your professional career or your vocational career, should I say. You adapt teaching to respond to the strengths and needs of all pupils, which is one of the real critical key challenges within our profession with such a breadth of learner experience and learner background in our classrooms. How are you evidencing and delivering that can often be a real challenge. You make accurate and productive use of assessment, and that is having a framework for assessment, knowing how to assess, evidencing progress for young people, feeding that into maybe school and possibly trust systems, and making sure that your assessment against national curriculum standards or exam board expectations is accurate and effective. You manage behaviour effectively to ensure that there's a good and safe learning environment. I think that's probably the thing that most of our trainees say is the bit that really gets some. I'd say that's actually one of the levels of intimidation for a lot of our trainees. They're concerned about behaviour. I think in reality, once there's some really good training in place and you've seen that modelled effectively in school, most people pick that up relatively quickly. But again, class to class, school to school, particularly in secondary, that could be hard when you're seeing hundreds of pupils a week because of the nature of your subjects and the way that the school organises itself. And likewise in primary, you've got a group and you'll get to know those individuals much better. But it does make it a challenge every day knowing that you're facing up to some of the same challenges on a day-to-day basis. How are you doing that? But particularly, how are you fulfilling the wider professional responsibilities of teacher professional expectations? Are you making a positive contribution to the wider life and ethos of the school? Are you developing effective professional relationships with colleagues? Are you knowing how and when to draw on advice and specialist support? That'll be changing a bit for you now because you've gotten through that first term of just kind of probably a little bit rabbit in the headlights and not knowing where to start. But now we're in a position where you're beginning to build more confidence, hopefully, feel more well equipped to plan and deliver great teaching. And obviously that percentage of your teaching is increasing also as the course develops. How are you working around with your support staff? Are you able to deploy them effectively? Are you maximizing their value? Do you not have support staff? Or do they visit infrequently? And so it's very difficult to know how to plan for them. But how are you seeking guidance from more experienced practitioners and teachers around the best way to work in partnership and as a team with your support staff in your class environments and actually outside of class too, within the wider life of the school? Are you making sure that really contributes to the outcomes of your pupils, going back to point one of these standards here? Are you taking responsibility for improving teaching through appropriate professional development, responding to advice and feedback from colleagues? I really hope you are. That is a fundamental part of teacher training, isn't it? In this very early stages of your training, you've got to take responsibility. You've got to engage in the RDK. You have to engage in the PGC. You have to be a reflective practitioner. You have to take feedback on board. All of these are uncomfortable places to be often. But this is how you grow. It's how you develop. And actually taking advice and feedback from colleagues is sometimes a really easy thing to do. Sometimes it can be quite hard, depends on how you're feeling as you approach your class or school on a daily basis. And do you, and this is the final part of this part 8 here, communicate effectively with parents with regards to pupils' achievement and well-being? Are you attending parents' evenings? Are you on the school gates? How are you greeting students in the morning? Do you get an interaction with parents? Obviously very different at secondary, in the way in which you talk to and interact with parents. Are you engaging in that process? Do you value that process? Really important here around achievements and well-being, particularly post-COVID. This well-being challenge is being felt across the country, and also bearing itself out in different behaviours within classrooms and forming positive routines again. So that's part 1 of the standards, and I highlight here 8.8 of that because that really reflects into part 2 of the teacher standards, which I'll pull up on screen here. And this is probably the most pertinent element in relation to this theme and this session today. It sort of details how a teacher is expected to demonstrate consistently high standards of personal and professional conduct. The following statements define the behaviours and attitudes which are set out and required as part of conduct throughout a teacher's career. So let's have a look at these. Teachers uphold public trust in the profession. Maybe that relates back to the principles, the Nolan principles I talked about earlier. And maintain high standards of ethics and behaviour within and outside of the school by treating pupils with dignity, building relationships rooted in mutual respect, and at all times observing proper boundaries appropriate to a teacher's professional position. I think, and I'm fairly sure, you will all know what that looks like when it's done badly. I suspect most of you could reflect on that from a teacher that you may have encountered within your own time at school, or indeed headlines that you may have seen which are unfortunate for the profession as a whole. Proper boundaries appropriate to a teacher's professional position. If you live in the community where you teach, that could be more difficult and more challenging. Indeed, if you are younger than I am and you happen to be, well, that's not true, but if you're out and about in town at the weekends and you're seeing families, etc., how are you maintaining that responsibility for appropriate teacher professional behaviours, good, effective relationships, mutual respect. You have a regard for the needs of pupils to safeguard pupils' well-being in accordance with the statutory provisions. And I think that is a given, and you've all received really robust training on that, and hopefully you're seeing that enacted on a daily basis in your school. You show tolerance of and respect for the rights of others in an increasingly diverse country, an increasingly diverse community with emerging themes and changes to our society. How is your mindset in relation to tolerance and respect for the individual rights? And that's sort of challenge you over the course of your career. It's a really important one to keep reflecting back on. Tolerance. Maybe we could do a little bit more of that in our world. Not undermining the fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty and mutual respect, and tolerance of those with different faiths. There's the word again, tolerance, different faiths and beliefs. Again, that's hard, can be really hard, but you're a teacher, it's your responsibility. You have to come to this with in the right frame of mind, with the right attitude, the right mindset. To be open and tolerant of people's different perspectives, different backgrounds, faiths, beliefs. Are you ensuring that personal beliefs are not expressed in ways which exploit pupils' vulnerability or might lead them to break the law? I would really, really, really hope this has never been a thing for you. And I really hope that's something you've never observed. Sadly, it must exist in our system, otherwise it wouldn't be there as part 2 of the standards. Teachers must have proper and professional regard of the ethos, policies and practices of the school in which they teach, and maintain high standards in their own personal attendance and punctuality. Interesting point, a really interesting point. We've been delivering teacher training here for nearly 10 years. And over the years, we've had trainees come to us to say, I don't respect, I don't follow, I will not follow the policy of that school in respect of this part of practice or that part of practice. It's quite an interesting point of view. Obviously, schools are all at different stages of an improvement journey and everyone's on a continued improvement cycle. But trainees have maybe a tolerance for an understanding of a school's particular way of doing something. How are you embracing the way in which your school, your trust, federation or individual academy has decided to allow it to set out its own policies? How are you informing policy development? You're a trainee teacher, you come to this with fresh eyes. It's important that your voice is heard potentially in policy reform. How are you asking questions about some of that policy, just to other professionals about how they interpret it and how they use it? How are you maintaining high standards in your attendance and punctuality? Are you there? Our pupils need you. It's your job, isn't it? This is where a profession vocation conversation comes in. Punctuality, the thing that we need all of our pupils to be. We all need to be more punctual in our lives. And finally, teachers must have an understanding of and always act within the statutory frameworks which set out their professional duties and responsibilities. Teacher standards are a really helpful document. They set out what it means to be an effective professional within our system. And if that's the first time you've really thought about them in any great detail, I'd encourage you to continue to. And particularly as teaching is a vocational profession, for some of you, straight out the back of university, without wanting to see this as an intimidating prospect, but you might well be teaching well into your 60s. So how as a 20-ish-year-old at some point now, some of you will be early 20s, some older, how are you going to continue to think about these standards and how you are adjusting, developing and growing? Can you think about someone you may have come across in your school, either when you were at school or in the placement that you're on now or have been in, that you think maybe isn't moving with this, isn't reflecting upon the standards, and isn't necessarily in keeping with what is our national framework for teacher expectations in this country. Okay, I want you to return back to the model. I want you to return back to that initial situation that you reflected upon earlier on, the situation in your school. Answer these questions for me. What element of what you saw may have related to one of these areas? It doesn't have to link necessarily, but if it does, then why does it? What did you hear? What did you see? What did you feel? And why do you think maybe, again, this is not a whistleblowing situation, why do you feel it just didn't quite fall in with this set of standards for our profession? I want you to maybe return back to that initial part of your notes, or just add it in now. It doesn't really matter. You write where you want to write and how you want to write. Just take some time just to write that down a little bit. Build on your thinking. Hopefully you've seen an emerging pattern here of this situation developing. We're encouraging you to reflect a bit more deeply on what you observed, maybe what you were part of. Just take a minute. Okay, so we have a model for teacher standards in England, and that's fab. We've got a framework for it. We're public servants. We uphold the national NOLAM principles within our everyday business. They're the broad approaches to effectively holding public office or being a civil servant within our country. And we've looked at what that specifically means for teachers in England. It's quite detailed, and there's obviously much more to expand upon if you were to look into the more detailed teacher standards document. They're the sort of headlines to a large extent. But what does wider industry look at when it comes to models of professionalism? So on the next slide here, and hopefully you can read this, this is an article taken from LinkedIn back in 2015, looking at professionalism plain and simple. 10 steps to a better you. That sounds good, doesn't it? So is there, I guess, more softer things that we maybe should be looking for here with regards to what professionalism looks like? So let's have a look at these. Appearance, didn't see that in the teacher standards. Demeanor, interesting. Reliability, maybe that talks and speaks to that notion of attendance, punctuality. But maybe reliability is much more than that. Competence, I think very much that talks to the teacher standards. Ethics, something we heard described in a few times there within the teacher standards. Maintaining your poise. Focus. What we're here to do. Who we're here to support. What needs to be achieved. Etiquette. Interesting. I can't see the word etiquette without thinking of Bridgerton or a golf course, but it's much more than that, of course. How are we courteous and supportive? How are we tolerant, which we read so much of in the teacher standards? Written correspondence, feels a bit 1930s, but this notion of effective written communication, how are we reporting back on what we're seeing? How are we reporting back to parents and leaders? Organisational skills. My word, I suspect you guys have found yourself in a more organised state in the past 4 or 5 months. found yourself being more organised, hopefully, than ever before. Maybe feels all a bit out of control at times, but it's a really intense year for you. We all know the importance of organisational skills, not only to be successful in the classroom within a school setting, but also just to manage our life in general. And finally, here we have accountability. Again, that maybe speaks back to those Nolan principles, but obviously the Teacher Standards Act is an accountability framework because they're which teachers are appraised against one way or another. So what do you think to that model? What's missing? Do you prefer it? Would you prefer that the teacher standards actually were a sort of broader brush approach and that maybe they were less defined because we should be acting against a set of principles like the Nolan principles from earlier? What might the consequence be of a looser model for the education system and for schools? What are the positives and what are the maybe potential negatives? It's something for you to think about. So this is an opportunity for you to just reflect a little bit more. So here's some bits just to pop up. Reflection's a really important thing, and you will know, I'm sure, that whoever your hub leads are or professional tutors are will have talked to you a lot about professionalism. Why is it important? You'll see the first session that we did on iL6, we very separately addressed emotional intelligence and resilience, almost as two separate sessions. And hopefully what you're seeing here now is we're giving you the opportunity to reflect, and we're going to begin to give you some increased frameworks and consider models for reflection through the session. We're asking you to return to that original situation. But reflectivity and reflectiveness is really important in terms of your learning. And what I particularly like about the Teacher Standards is this notion of ongoing professional learning, this notion that teaching is a craft and you as a teacher need to continue to invest in your professional development, your ongoing learning. And things that you're addressing now in your classrooms, things that you're thinking about, whether it's a curriculum design or whether it's even the teacher standards themselves. In 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and 30 years' time, they're definitely going to be different. Your classroom will be different. Your environment will be different. The expectations of you will be different. Adaptive teaching will be different. Nothing's going to stay the same, necessarily. And so, how are you going to continue to be a reflective learner? How are you going to continue to invest time in your development? So there's a couple of little bits here. Reflective learning is a way of allowing learners to step back from their learning experience, help them to develop critical thinking and improve on future performance by analysing what they've learned and how far they've come. Hopefully you're doing that with your ITT journey. If you're not being kind to yourself, you should be. You've come so far already. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. But you've done so well. If you haven't taken the time to give yourself a pat on the back, and I hope you did at Christmas, do that this weekend. You are trying your hardest, and you will be successful. And that speaks back to the resilience that we talked about last time. Another definition, if used effectively and purposefully, reflection facilitates ongoing personal and professional learning and creates and develops practitioners' capabilities of demonstrating their progression towards learning outcomes and required standards. Reflection can also provide a structure in which to make sense of learning, so that concepts and theories become embedded in practice and constant thought and innovation are simultaneously fostered. I love this. Reflection can provide a structure in which to make sense of learning. And that's what we're trying to do today and support you with today, is to give you a structure, give you an opportunity just to think about that one situation, that one thing earlier that just kind of didn't match just sort of grated on you, or you left you feeling a bit unsettled. How much have you thought about it? Have you unpacked it? Well, you are today. This is your chance to unpack it. Don't necessarily want you to do anything with it. we are giving you an opportunity to unpack it nonetheless. So these may be just definitions of reflection. I'm sure you've seen already. I know we talked quite a lot about the what, so what, now what reflection model, and we won't be addressing that during today's session because I know you're all too familiar with that as a model, but we will look at that another model a little bit later during today's session. So look, we're an hour in. I'm sure we all need a little break. So this is our opportunity just to have a screen break for 10 minutes. So we'll come back here at 11 past, if that's okay, if we're going to be tight on timings. So go and get a coffee. If you're at Flying High, just because those people that are live during the session are, go and get a really nice one from that machine. For the rest of you, go and do what you need to do, have a comfort break, etc. We'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Thanks for your engagement and concentration in the first part of this session. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you've had a chance to have a minute away from the screen. Maybe for those of you that are sitting together, have a chance for a bit of discussion. Just wanted to thank Kate for a couple of comments she made, particularly in relation to the notion of public service, and I guess the Nolan principles we talked about earlier. So she's put here, and you can see on the screen, as a public service, we provide integrity and respect, and should be at the core of our practice as well. And she's also gone on to say that she often describes myself as a public servant. I've been a social worker, and I'm now training to be a teacher. I think that's a really great point. The social workers, of course, are the butt of a lot of negative headlines, but ultimately do really critical work for our children and families. And she went on then to say about, as teachers, we're entrusted with people's children, who are the most precious people in their lives. We're also responsible for teaching the future generation of adults. I think Kate really reflecting in there and on there about some of the significant and important parts of your role, which I guess speak to both the teacher standards, but just this broader sense of why it's important for you as teachers to be a professional, and act and deliver your work in a professional way. Thanks for pulling those on the screen, Dirk. That's great. So let's think about that initial situation and let's get a little bit deeper on it. You probably think I might be labouring this point a little bit, but I did describe in the last slide before we broke about giving you an opportunity just to have a framework for discussion. So we're going to take that initial situation that you talked about, and I hope it's got enough in it for you to be able to engage in this way. And if it hasn't, then maybe think about a new situation. Maybe think about, now I'm asking you to really reflect hard on an experience or something that you've been involved with. Maybe think about a new situation or scenario for this next exercise. This framework, I think, is really helpful. Indeed, I've used it myself on a number of occasions. And we're going to go through Graham Gibbs' reflective cycle, which was published in 1998, with the aim of giving structure to learning and learning from experiences. At its foundation, it's a creation of a cyclical framework for examining experiences and allowing the user to learn and plan from things that either went well or didn't go well. The process has got 6 stages to work through, and we're going to work through them on a one-by-one basis. So either return to that original scenario, that original situation you thought about at the very beginning and you've continued to think about since, or think about a new one, then be prepared to unpick it in a little bit more detail. So let's have a look. The description of the experience. What happened? Let's write these down. When? Where did it happen? Could have been in the playground, the classroom, the staff room, outside of school even. Could have been in the training situation at university. Might have been in somewhere more private, like the toilets or somewhere like that. Might have been a passing conversation or something you walked in the middle of. Who was there? Who was present? Was everybody present that was involved in it? Or were there other people too? What did you and other people do? Just to gently listen in. Were you an active part of this? Is it something you were directly at the centre of? What did you do? What was the outcome of that situation? Why were you there? Might be a fairly obvious question to ask if it's in the middle of a classroom or a staff room, but why were you there? It was something a little bit less routine, perhaps. And what did you want to happen? Just going to pause, allow you to take some notes. So we look there at the first stage of this cycle as the descriptive phase. Let's describe the situation. Some useful opening questions there. Who, what, when, why, where. I'm sure they feature a lot in your teaching. So let's think about your feelings and thoughts about the experience. They seem to be the same prompts. That's an odd one. Just bear with me a second. So I'll reflect back on the original model for this, just to check that I've pulled this across properly from my slide deck. I'm reflecting myself now on how that might have looked a bit more professional. Don't laugh, please. Okay, I've got them on my screen, not on yours. How did you feel about the situation? We talked about this earlier. How did the situation compare with what you expect within your value set or your expectations of others? What were you thinking during and after? What do you think about it now? What might other people have thought? Okay. Let's move on to the next element of this. What was good and bad about the experience? What didn't go so well? And what went well? What did you and other people contribute, either positively or negatively? We're evaluating the experience here, both good and bad. And hopefully, as mentioned before, it gives you an opportunity just to think this through a little. Maybe it's something that you've not had a chance to dig any deeper into. And now's your opportunity. Next stage is around analysis to make sense of the situation. Why did things go well? Why didn't it go well? What's your analysis? What sense can I make of the situation that I was a part of or experienced or observed? Is context important within that? All too often we hear examples, particularly in the media, of someone saying something or a snippet of a conversation being misconstrued. I can think of recent ones, particularly around Prince Harry's claims around his time within the military, which was a misinterpretation of perhaps what was written properly. There are loads of examples, aren't there? What sense have you made of this now the context is there? What knowledge, my own or others, for example, academic literature, can help me understand the situation? And let's conclude about what you've learned and what you could have done differently. So what did I learn from the situation? How could this have been a more positive situation for everybody involved? What skills do I need to develop for me to handle a situation like this better in the future? What else could I have done? Let's make some notes on that in whatever way you're doing that. The final stage here is around action plan for how you deal with these similar situations in the future, or just general changes that you might think are appropriate or might be helpful in the future. If I do the same thing again, or I was involved in the same situation again, what might I do differently? How am I going to develop the skills required to maybe approach that differently? Does that matter of experience or a knowledge base? Savviness? Is it something I'm likely to experience again in the future? What skills do you need to maybe approach it differently? How can I make sure that I can act differently next time? There's an implication in that suggesting that you maybe are guilty of not doing things in the right way, and I don't want you to read it that way at all. But if this is something you've been reflecting on recently as an event that unsettled you, troubled you a little bit, it might be a part of this that made you feel like you might have done something differently to change the outcome of the situation. So I hope that as an exercise is a useful one. And as mentioned before, it's a cyclical process here. And you can see we started with description, moved into feelings, did an evaluation, we analysed, we concluded, we moved into an action plan phase. Personally, I've been thinking that's a cracking model for quite some time. And I think there's many, many uses for a situation like that. It's a good thought process for one. I think it could be helpful in reflecting on your experience of professional learning in the future. I think it's a useful framework for your students, pupils, children that you're working with and supporting. It might be helpful in your day-to-day life. Maybe that little framework, that little cyclical framework, and you'll have access to all these resources following the session, could be really good. Just a useful structure for you to just unpick a situation, think about how you might do things differently. So hopefully you found that useful as a model, and also just found the time help useful just to sit and think, to give it a little bit more depth to that original discussion and that original kind of question I asked you, which is what's the situation? What did you see? Da, 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 da. That's fine, but let's go deeper on that, and I think that's what we've just done. So hopefully you found that helpful. So let's return just back to the teacher standards again. We went through these earlier, so I'm not going to repeat them. They're all on the screen and you can see. I want you to be a bit more discerning in this phase of the session. Just think about what are the nuanced points. Let's think about these in a bit more detail. What are some of the nuanced points on this list? Which of these teacher standards might be more challenging or problematic for teachers and school leaders? Maybe just have a little read through, ponder on that for a moment. And I'd be quite interested to get your views on that in the chat bar, actually. So which of these have got these nuanced points might be more challenging or problematic for teachers and school leaders? It'd be really interesting to get your views on this. If you wouldn't mind just returning to the chat bar for me. Any comments welcome on this? And what I'd be really looking for here, just a little thought or two on this notion of X could be problematic because. Don't need to say too much more. Certainly don't need to be 300-word submissions, but just some general chat and feedback would be really helpful. Just have a look at this. We're keen to just unpick this with you as teachers. There's no rush for this. It takes a little bit more deep thought. Can you think of a particular one of those top 2 of the standards that you think that's open for interpretation? You could see that might be easily misunderstood, misconstrued. Potentially it's a little bit open. It could cause problems for teachers, schools, school leaders. Think about some scenarios that might be really difficult for you to manage. I mentioned earlier about outside of the school building, living in the community where children from your school live and wanting to be an adult like any other adult. So that's hard, isn't it? Really encourage a bit of contribution. Let me know what you think.
Thinking another one, James, is the use of social media. Obviously, becoming more and more prevalent at the time, and actually for the current applications coming in onto the course, obviously you won't have done this when you came on last year, but we are asking the question now. We're having to ask the question around people's social media use and to describe your digital footprint coming into the profession. So that's a new question that we've added to the application process that you wouldn't have been part of. So yeah, it's becoming more and more prevalent, isn't it? And that positive use of social media, as you know, we really encourage the use of Twitter, and we encourage you to use Twitter for education purposes. And it's it's thriving on there, but then also how do you balance that, as James saying, with just being an adult? And I was about to say have Facebook, but I don't think a lot of people have Facebook anymore, do they? But yeah, so anything that you're into.
Absolutely. We're going to move on to looking at that in a little bit of detail in a moment, just some of the ethical challenges around that. Okay. We've not had any contributions, so I'm going to take that as that either people are thinking. We can always return back to this a little bit later in the session if need be. Okay. So to the point that Dirk raises, so as educational leaders, there are updates to guidance that come through on an annual basis, and a document that you'll be all too familiar with is the Keeping Children Safe in Education document, which is updated on an annual basis. And one of the updates that came through this year was you can see online. So online searches during the recruitment process. The guidance now states that education settings should consider conducting online searches as part of their due diligence during the recruitment process. The stated aim of this is that it may help to identify any incidents or issues that have happened and are publicly available online, which the school or college might want to explore with the applicant at the interview stage. It's an interesting point, isn't it? So what does that mean? What we're supposed to do? Does that mean that every school in the country should be spending an amount of time trawling through applications and applicants' social media profiles? What's your reaction to that? Particularly those of you that have maybe come from a different career or profession. I'm sure you've already done some thinking on this. How does it link to the notion of professionalism? Like Dirk said earlier, we talk about digital footprint. For those of us that were, God, I keep making myself sound really old, but those of you that's around at the kind of the beginning of social medias and MySpaces and Facebooks and Twitters, and is there stuff you put up there in the past, or maybe things that you've thought in the past that might have gone online that you reflect on now and you can't quite imagine how you thought that or why you thought that? You maybe feel embarrassed by it or ashamed. What do you think school leaders should do? Is that appropriate? It's ethical? It's a really difficult one for leaders to think about in terms of the time it takes to do this, how you do it, snooping around on people's social media accounts. They are public, as it says in the document. However, I think there's a slightly bigger question here, which is around the things that we talk about, we hear about in the media a lot: freedom of speech, freedom of thought, tolerance. Who is to be the judgment or ruler on some of that stuff? Who's to suggest that someone's personal interests should affect them being negative role model in the classroom, unable to meet the teacher standards? So I'm not putting that out there as a thing for you to decide on. I'm just giving you an example of some of the policy shifts and changes that come through our system from time to time that just maybe get leaders thinking differently about other bigger worldly challenges, more societal based issues. And I think the principle of this is really positive. I think the application of it is really challenging. And I also think, and I know Dirk knows as well, that in the original thinking that we did in response to this policy change, it's extremely costly. Private organisations from across the sector telling us they could charge us a fortune to look through people's social media and give us a report, which is fab. But the sector hadn't allowed for that, hadn't considered that that might be a thing. So how else could we test this that's more appropriate? And as Dirk said, this year within our interview process, which you won't have experienced, we're asking much more explicit questions about an individual's social media and history and what they may have put up there that they perhaps might want to consider reflecting upon or removing or thinking differently about, but also what they need to be and who they need to be moving forward. So I think it's a really interesting kind of moment for you to think about both professionalism in terms of the expectations of the sector. It's also an opportunity for you to just reflect a little bit there on some of this stuff is a little bit more nuanced. Some of it isn't as straightforward as perhaps it might appear in a policy or guidance document. And actually, that's not always just a thing that you perhaps might be dealing with as a teacher, but as you progress into leadership in the future, these are some of the difficult challenges and decisions and discussions you'll be having with other senior leaders and colleagues in schools. So I just wanted to leave that there as a bit of an opportunity. And I'm just looking back at the chat bar, and Phoebe has kindly responded to the previous point around some of the nuanced points. And she said that exploring British values in deprived white British working class area, it's even more crucial to explore alternative values and faiths when the children aren't exposed at home. It's a fantastic point, Phoebe. Really good. You're absolutely right. Exposure to, thinking around, respect for, returning to that point around tolerance for different faiths, beliefs, backgrounds. And there are some absolutely amazing resources out there and some amazing organisations out there that sort of really bring that to life and challenge some of those bits of thinking about people's backgrounds and our relationships, friendships with people from a whole range of different worlds. And I agree with you. I'd also challenge back to you on that, Phoebe, and encourage you to not just think about it from a British working class area. I think some of those issues are a challenge in what we might consider to be more affluent communities, where students and pupils are surrounded with people that look the same as them and come from similar backgrounds to them. And that concept is explored further in Matthew Said's Rebel Ideas book, which I would fully recommend you have a look at in the future, which talks about kind of cognitive diversity, which is not just specifically to British working class areas, but it's a really fabulous point. So thank you for contributing to that. Okay. So we're going to shift. Sorry, just before we do, I just want to just re-encourage you to think about now, about you in 5 years, you in 15, and you in 25 years into your career. Just in relation to that last point here. You know, I mentioned earlier, and it's true, isn't it, that nothing stays the same. Things change. Imagine what social media. I remember. Oh God, I'm doing the age thing again. But I remember the beginning of MySpace, and I'm only 23. But I remember the beginning of Facebook, and I remember what it was and what it tried to achieve. I'm sure you've all seen the films, and those of you who remember it. I mean, it was what it was at the time, and now it's something totally different. And it won't exist, will it, in however many years' time? It'll be something totally different. And Meta and all the technological changes that come with our world, this stuff is just a genuinely evolving picture in terms of social networking, online, augmented reality. It's all an evolving picture, and it will have another huge step and leap in terms of rapid change and growth in the next few years. So what do you as a professional need to do? What's your professional responsibility to maintain an understanding of what that looks like? I know particularly in secondary and in some cases in primary, this recent issue around the Andrew Tate scenario has been very, very problematic around misogynist behaviour and the mistreating of women and attitudes towards life and outlook. I know that's been a real challenge for schools recently. And that's just another example of how you as a teacher need to be agile and fleet of foot and understand some of the consequences of what we're seeing in our society, and how that will have a genuine influence on the thinking of the students and young people that are walking into your classrooms every day. So I'm not asking you to come up with a plan here, just asking you a question. How do you intend to remain in line with the curve, as part of the wave, not necessarily on the crest of it, but part of the wave? How are you going to continue to think about that moving forward? And I think actually that speaks to this sort of last part of the session, which is just around professional learning. And this is something that obviously we're deeply passionate about. It's an organisational aim of ours to provide you with really good, effective learning and professional learning. And I genuinely hope that you think favourably of the way we're doing this. Maybe not quite so much this last 90 minutes, but certainly the course so far. And hopefully you're beginning to see yourself as an ongoing learner. So there's a little snippet here from Education Scotland's national model of professional learning. It's really good. It's really interesting. And it's a really nicely laid out document. And I think it'd be worth you having a look at if you had the time to see how the Scottish education system, which does differ from the English one, views the teacher as a professional learner. So there's some really nice bits here. This is a dynamic relationship between learners, the learning of children, young people and adults, and the educator's professional learning. These are deeply interconnected through the learning feedback loop at the heart of the model. The educator's professional learning should be informed by the learner's experience, voice and need. In turn, the professional learning of the educator should impact positively on experience of learners. And finally, there's much more to this document, of course, but professional learning should take account of and reflect the unique circumstances of the learning community. So we've got 3 points here, I think. So the first bit for me is around modelling. And I think this is a really important point. You know, you are all deeply entrenched in a very challenging, exciting, rich learning experience. This year is for some of you, it's a steeper learning curve. For some of you, it's certainly a learning curve. You are absorbing information. You are experiencing new things. You are dealing with some of the organizational challenges of becoming a teacher. You're being readied for the profession in an immersive style, as well as academically being challenged by your university studies. You're getting that really good balance of experience, practical insight and input, training and academic study. And so therefore, for the pupils, students that you work with every day, you are modeling learning. You continue to model what it means to take on new knowledge and new information. And they know that. And that's why it says it's here. It's deeply interconnected. They can see you're learning and that'll inspire them to learn. And look, it isn't going to be possible, is it, for you to be this engaged in your significant professional development every year. But as you move into your ECT years, as you then move beyond those ECT years into your sort of main pay scale years, what's your commitment going to be as an education professional, as a teacher, to continuing to learn? And we reflected on that a minute ago with regards to the increases technology and the challenges that might bring for you as an individual in the future. But what about your professional knowledge? What about pedagogy, lesson design, curriculum knowledge, subject knowledge, knowledge of broader agencies, knowledge of something specific, maybe a subject specialism or SEN? How are you going to make sure that you don't stand still, that you continue to invest? And some of that might be quite a pragmatic thing. It might be that you're going to choose to be employed or try and become employed in a school that's really richly engaged in professional learning. That's not always the case. Not all schools invest the same way in teacher professional learning. Some schools have exceptionally robust, really well thought through structures that every teacher is hooked into something. And some schools are less so, and it's more individualized. It's more for the teacher, for them to manage their own professional learning. So that's just a point there about the way in which you model. And the second point here is around any professional learning that you undertake being informed by the learner's experience, voice and needs. And this is at the heart of actually the DFE's Teacher CPD Charter. This is at the heart of all of the EEF research. And what we're saying here ultimately, and what those organisations are saying here, is that teacher professional learning should be rooted in the needs of its young people. And so what is it you are engaging in learning about, engaging in developing with regards to your practice? And what impact is that going to bring about for your pupils? Now, we'll all have a slightly different view on that. So this could be a subject knowledge development, it could be a lesson design thing, it could be a pedagogical development, any of those different things. It could be anything that you're engaged with I would imagine these things will always be connected to your school's improvement plan or raising achievement plan. And I agree. I think that therefore, if you're investing time and energy and thinking into whether it's more effective interventions, different teaching strategies, etc., they absolutely should have student progress and student achievement at the heart of them, for sure. I think there's some other stuff as well. I think you're entitled to this type of experience. We haven't really talked about teaching really today in terms of what you do in the classroom. Sort of enabled you to think differently, maybe, just have a bit of space and time. You're not marking at the minute, hopefully. I'm not watching you, but I don't think you are. And you're not planning, are you, at the moment? Probably. You're not going to drop a couple of lesson plans out and get resources ready for your next lesson, I hope, during this session. So my view is absolutely that the vast majority of your professional learning that you're engaged in should be centered around your pupil outcomes. But I don't think there's anything wrong with some of your professional learning being centered around you as an individual, giving you some frameworks for thinking about you as a leader, maybe in the future. And after all, we are called inspiring leaders, something that's really important to us and all of our partners. So let's not get totally hung up on this notion, but where you do, think about developing subject knowledge and developing your practice. And if it's possible, then for sure, let's make sure that this always relates back to student experience and student outcomes and achievement. So how do you as teachers plan to? There's some questions for you here, and you can write these things down. I'm not suggesting it's your mission statement necessarily. How do you plan to maintain and invest time in your professional learning? How might you do that? Might you just do this as an hour a week? Might this be what your half terms are for, when you've got different pressures and challenges, but maybe you just constantly have a new book on the go and engage in that? Are you going to be that podcast person that is just always listening to something on the way in and way out of school, that's going to inform your thinking or your practice? I'd say that's probably more me at the minute. I find that a good use of my time. How are you going to remain research informed? You're going to hopefully all pass through a PGCE qualification as part of this program. And good for you for choosing a program that includes that. It's deliberate choice by us to ensure that you get that academic challenge in addition to the academic challenge you get from our program, our practitioner-led program. Is that the end for you? Do you think your PGCE is you and out? Your 60 credits are in the bag? Or do you think maybe you'll continue on with that? You think you might move on to take that into a master's qualification in the future? How would you build in time for that? What would you be interested in researching? As you will probably know, some of you have got masters, I'm sure. It's a more specific model of research and learning. What do you want to know more about? I know when I completed my masters a few years ago, I know Dirk the same. There were people in there with all sorts of interesting inquiry questions that they were spending lots of time and energy researching and hopefully finding some answers for. Next point. How are you going to be professionally curious? I would imagine, I would hope, this language of curiosity within your classrooms and within your schools is becoming commonplace. We all want our students to be curious individuals, don't we? Evidence tells us that curiosity is a very significant skill and characteristics in terms of young people's success. I can think of a particular example from the Rebel Ideas book that I referenced earlier of a particular technology company in the US who were trying to find the variables that impacted the success of certain people they'd interviewed, and they looked at about 15,000 staff within their call center workforce. And they looked at age and tenure, they looked at qualifications, looked at education, they looked at family type, looked at ethnicity, looked at where they lived, they looked at loads of different parameters about what was the determinant of their success within their key individuals. And one of the things they found to be a correlation in a really random twist of fate was the web browser that the individual used to apply for the job in the first place. The findings were that those that used Safari and Edge, or the previous Microsoft version, were average performers because that was a standard pre-installed web browser within their systems. But they also found that those that used Chrome or Firefox or another web browser that required individuals to be maybe more curious in their pursuit of looking for a better internet browser, that correlated directly with the success of the individuals in that particular call center. Very random finding, but nonetheless interesting in terms of what it said about the individuals that were wanting a better experience than they got from Safari. So curiosity is important, whether it's a call center or a school. It's important because it's how we ask questions of our world, the things around us, what's being said. So how are you going to continue to be professionally curious in the future? How are you going to encourage, support and challenge from those around you? And how are you going to contribute to supporting and challenging those around you? At the minute, and look, I really sincerely hope this will be the case. It certainly has been with our previous years. You've got a wonderful bunch of people around you that are learning in the same way you're learning. And I would imagine, whether it's as a whole group or within individual smaller groups, you've found some really deep, meaningful, professional and personal friendships and relationships. And they'll carry on. You will, wherever you end up teaching, you'll always remember the year that you spent training together. And that will bind you together. You've got a shared experience, haven't you? You're friends for a reason. And you're probably friends for life. But in your new schools, when you eventually move into your ECT roles and you build new friendships and professional relationships, how are you going to continue to find ways in which you can be supported and can support, you can receive challenge and can challenge those around you to develop your learning? I think it's a really important point. How do you create those conditions? Who do you need to talk to in school? How do you do it? Will there be a culture of it? I hope so. But if there's not, how might you maybe start to build that culture in the school that you go and work in? With that primary, secondary, where it's departmental, phase-based, year group based. You might find yourself in a tiny village school. You might find yourself in the biggest secondary school in England. How are you going to build that support and challenge in? How are you going to find it? Because at the minute you get lots of support and challenge from your mentor, from your learning coaches, your ITT coordinators, from your professional tutors and your hub leaders, from university colleagues. That might not be there forever. So how are you going to substitute that with something you want? How are you going to model learning to your pupils? And we talked about this before. All of those things above, in terms of your investing time in learning, remaining in research informed, being professionally curious, supporting and challenging those around you, being supported and challengers, I think they're all really healthy things to be modelling to your pupils. I hope you'd agree. Maybe if they know that you're engaged in your own learning, if you've constantly got a book on the go, or you're constantly talking about the things you've been finding out and discovering, that will probably model to them that that's a really good way to be as an adult within our society. I suspect you could probably think and feel about what that might look like. Maybe over the next 3 years or so, you'll move into a fairly structured ECT program, as mentioned before, and we'll make sure that you're supported in doing that, as will your hosts or employing school. But what about 10 years, 20 years? Keep doing this, keep asking you this. I think it's all too easy to think about next week, next month, maybe even next year. I don't know what your answers are going to be. You probably don't know yourself. But I think there's no harm in getting your head up a little bit and thinking about in the future. For you, all of you individually, that'll look very different. Some of you might start a family, some of you might have already got a family. Everyone's got a completely different life. So where do you fit this stuff in? How does this become part of the fabric of who you are as an education professional, as a teacher? Just something for you to think about. Okay, I'm getting close to the end now. I'm going to move on to our last slide. And I think this is probably a good thing in lots of ways, is that you're not alone in developing yourself as a professional. In fact, I think, and I know I spoke with a few of you ahead of time, ahead of you starting the course, I did a session on professional journeys and career pathways in teaching. I know some of you may have attended that or watched that retrospectively. But you are walking into a career pathway here that is scaffolded beautifully and has so much opportunity for you to continue to grow and thrive. And there's just a couple of bodies here, just a couple of organisations that are properly committed to this. And I'll start with the Department for Education. You know, they have heavily invested in initial teacher training and will continue to. They continue to heavily invest in the early career framework and the early career programs that you will experience as ECTs. They fund the program and its delivery. They fund mentor release, and they have helped build a really robust framework for a real consistent approach to early career induction across the country, which has never been there before. They are constantly reviewing teacher pay and conditions. They are setting out standards and charters for what effective professional learning should look like. They contribute to the funding of groups like the Education Endowment Foundation, who ensure that our profession continues to be research informed. The DFE are a force for positivity, whilst you may feel differently from time to time, but they also significantly invest in and subsidise school leadership qualifications, which are very knowledge heavy. So the DFE are there as an organisation that got your back to a large extent, but there are some other bodies that have emerged more recently. So one that you might be familiar with here is Teaching School Hub Council. That might not be in your day-to-day vocab, but you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with what a teaching school hub is about. They're a body that are ultimately funded by the Department for Education to facilitate that on a regional level. They receive a little bit of funding and they are tasked with creating effective learning continuum support for yourselves individually as you move through your career. They'll be the ones that will be responsible most likely for your ECT journey, not entirely, but mainly across the country. There are 87 of them across the country at the moment. They'll be responsible and I would imagine involved in supporting you into your leadership journey in the future, which now is more diverse. It's not all about middle leadership, senior leadership, headship, executive leadership. There are more specific and alternative pathways and routes, which can include things like literacy leadership and early years leadership and SEN leadership and other things. So teaching school hubs are well worth knowing about, being familiar with and looking for if you're not familiar with them. And of course, we have 2 within this partnership already through Flying High Futures and through the Red Hill Teaching Hub, which may well be the hosts of your training, but may not. And for those of you that aren't connected to those groups, there are relationships with them, with your trusts and partners that are leading on your training. The Chartered College of Teaching is something that you can all join for free. It was established about 5 or 6 years ago with a mission to really begin to put teaching on an equal playing field with some of the chartered professions, engineering, accountancy, some of the things that we've explored maybe at the beginning of today's session, and now has an opportunity for any teacher in this country to become a member of its organisation for free in your ITT year, and then for a relatively low cost as you move through your teaching career. And as an organisation, they turn out some of the most fantastic, digestible thinking and research, which they send to you in a lovely magazine on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. And for us, I know for myself and Dirk, we really find that a helpful organisation to be a part of, and their website is superb in terms of new thinking, deeper research, making actually sense of some of the things we perhaps already know as educators. And so I think it's a real force for good in the system, and I think I would encourage teachers to be a part of it. It won't do everything for you, but it will do some really good things. And at the bottom here, you've got some obvious ones, right? The university. I mentioned earlier about some of you might want to move on to postgraduate study, both the University of Leicester and Nottingham Trent, as well as our other regional universities offer master's level, PhD level study. Some of you may end up in a career in academia in the future. So I would encourage you to look at that. The school that you are employed by, I really hope, has a proper process around how you can access professional learning in the future, how you can maintain great quality in the classroom, constantly continue to be challenged and provoked and take on new knowledge and experiences. And of course us, right? I put us down at the bottom, in the middle, but it's fairly true. We're not just here as an organisation for your teacher training year. We are actively involved in your teaching school hub partnerships. We have a partnership now of 15 academy trusts within the region, which hopefully is going to grow this year. We work with people that you will work with on a daily basis, and we're interested and committed to knowing how you get on in your career, and we continue to be here. We're a constant and we're a supporter of you throughout your professional career. So I'm going to stop sharing now, but I hope you found that session this morning helpful. If you haven't, I'm sorry. We intended for it to be helpful for you. If nothing more, just the time to be able to think about you, about where you are, about maybe some of the experiences that you had so far within your training. And also just to think about where you might be in the future. So what have we done? We've picked a situation. We've had an opportunity to reflect. I suppose the gap task for you would be to apply the what so what now, what methodology, which you might well choose to do to that situation. You may have dropped that situation off at the very beginning of the call. It wasn't deep enough for you to get into, but it gave you a bit of a framework for thinking things through, whether it's that or any future situation. So we hope that's helpful. We've explored the teacher standards and maybe explored some of the nuanced points of it. And we've thought a little bit about how we model professional learning to our students in the future and how you continue to be challenged as we go forward. So we hope that's helpful. We commit to these sessions to be about 2 hours long. It's a lot of screen time. And Dirk, I don't know if you've got any comments that you want to add in before we head off.
No, just a big thank you. And as James says, do let us know. So there will be a feedback. So Effie will share a feedback form and let us know. It's the first time we've run this this year. So please let us know if you prefer a different style of let us know for that July one. So we're covering creativity and being knowledgeable for the final 2 of the 6 in July. So let us know before then. We quite like this. We think it's a bit of something different and supports that idea that it's not assessed in any way and it's in a different format to your normal session delivery. But thank you. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Yeah, take care, everybody.